Hello there, this is Sohail Hasni, your host at Energypreneurs. Cheap solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles are changing the transport and energy sector as we know. I bring in guests to this podcast who will help you with their ideas to navigate this energy transition. Thank you for joining. Good morning, Anthony. I'm in Manila. Where are you today?
Good morning, Sahel. Actually, in Melbourne this morning, enjoying a bit of a cold break after we've had some warmer weather.
Ah, lovely. I'm actually flying to Sydney tonight. Okay, maybe you introduce yourself, who you are, what you have been doing, and then we take it from there.
Thanks, Sahel. What I've been doing recently is a combination of 30 years of experience. I started off for roughly, I'm going to break into 10 years working building electricity networks, then 10 years in the policy space looking at energy regulation, policy, benchmarking and performance around the world. And the last 10 years been focused on consumer energy resources and specifically solar rooftops, electric vehicles and home batteries, community batteries and those sorts of things. I find that absolutely fascinating. I love the work and it's a vast technology change that's occurring and it's been a great benefit to consumers already. Something we need to do to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. It's technically complex and it's got behavioural aspects and find it a fascinating area to work in and try and advance for the betterment of consumers.
Yeah, it's a fascinating world we are in right now, right? Because when you start in the electricity industry, I also grew up in the State Electricity Commission of Victoria. It was us, the utility people, and them, the consumers, right? Consumers are on the table everywhere, right?
We still have this we know better attitude that is prevalent because of the complexity of the challenges that we face. People like myself and others, we're so in the depths of it that we sometimes struggle to understand that the consumer is involved, has a right, has a voice, and needs to be listened to. We sometimes, myself included, dismiss that voice because they don't understand the complexity of policy or the technical challenges facing it. And that's the problem of people trying to make that help the change rather than the consumer.
Yes, attitude-wise, that may be the case still, but consumer now has the technology through rooftop solar and the batteries and EVs to basically be part of it technically, right?
Absolutely. They're being part of the grid, part of the energy infrastructure, really with their own motivations, form a cohesive and workable grid. The first challenges appearing in Australia, South Australia and other states as well now, where there's so much rooftop solar that it's actually meeting all of the demand at certain times of the year. And that brings with it real challenges to system stability and control. It's probably going to be unique to just a few locations like Australia and Hawaii because of our really high rates of PV adoption. But then following that, EVs will create risks and opportunities for the grid as consumers adopt them en masse. So what we're seeing is a transference of the system and control architecture being focused on centralized grid to control architecture needing to be focused on a decentralized grid. So how do we have the system and control protections that you need for a reliable grid on these distributed energy resources, EVs for the rest of the world, when there's more capacity in EV batteries bidirectionally, so it can be charging and discharging? What do we do under that circumstance? We've got more capacity there, and we've actually got capacity on the grid. The number of electrons being generated equal to the number of electrons being consumed on the grid, millisecond by millisecond basis. How do we keep that system stability? Still a lot of work to do, but it's fascinating.
I think the last bit that you mentioned, I personally think that's what will create the most interesting aspect, because right now people say, is a liability, it's going to grow demand. Yes, that might, but average person not going to use more than 10 kilowatt hour from EVs every day. Even in Australia, I think average person does 38 kilometer a day. Many people charge at home. I have a Model Y. I mean, my wife charges once a week. I did 1,000 kilometers all the way to Sunshine Coast, but you don't do that every day. So
No.
My question to you, Australia has one of the highest rooftop solar installation, more than I think 1.3 kilowatt right now. Now you're generating, say, about 40 kilowatt hour a day at home on a
Yeah.
typical sunny day.
Yeah.
And you will end up having a 20 kilowatt hour batteries eventually at home.
Yeah.
Really big.
Large back car.
Yeah. Because right now Tesla Powerwall is about 13. So I'm just saying, say 20, 25. So you have 65 kilowatt hour technically, or 60 that you can bring into the grid if you're full.
Yeah.
And your average consumption is 10, 15, even if you have a heated swimming pool. If individual households bring it to the grid, 30 kilowatt hour a day, that is with V2G is threatening to the utilities. Then utilities saying, oh my God, these electric vehicles are terrible. We have to supply them. Australian demand has been consistently going down last 10 years, especially in Melbourne.
It has. So electric vehicles, as you point out, will undoubtedly change that. The adoption of electric vehicles, even under the most benign scenario where consumers are very aware or responding to the prices and signals on the grid and congestion, are still going to create increases to demand. Obviously, tariff reform is something that's been mooted. I've seen work and I've been involved in work that sort of high network build and capital build. I think that's going to happen, but we can significantly reduce the amount of that build and the capital required if we provide better signals and systems to support consumers in making decisions that support everyone, better outcomes for everyone. So tariff reform, yes, but also incentives, smart vehicle communication systems with your smart charger or battery, information campaigns, behavioral change that comes with all of this stuff. There needs to be a raft of solutions delivered to help consumers save. At the moment, in the Australian grid, we only use the top 25% for 40 to 80 hours a year. So 25% of the grid's capacity, which is a $100 billion grid in Australia, we've just spent $25 billion to run it just to match those 40 hours. If we can avoid that with distributed energy, smarter control systems, support systems, incentives for EVs. We don't have to have such a peaky system that supports those few exceptional days on the grid. We can be smarter about that. And that will be a huge saving for consumers. Utility companies in Australia, there's a trade-off here. We're lucky in one respect. We have vertical separation between the generation and retailing arms from the transmission distribution arms. Transmission distribution is going to grow under any scenario. They should be happy because that supports increased returns for shareholders, etc. And they get greater utilisation of the grid if we can have tariff reform. It's probably a split incentive in terms of tariff reform because tariff reform would probably reduce the overall capital bill. But if they overbill and haven't done sufficient to mitigate that bill, there's a potential clawback. So there are some countervailing pressures. Generation, that's it, the big one. There's a time frame for all the generation plants in Australia to be phased out, all the fossil fuel ones. Some have gone already and more are going every year. So I think that's acknowledged. Where the retailers and large system generators move to from there, have they get involved in the distributed energy of the future? If they choose, how they're going to provide products and services that customers want in this space. The virtual power plants likely a target for those gentailers, but it requires a flex from where they are at the moment in terms of large centralized asset managers to the customer support systems and high disaggregated and complex architectures that will need to be supported in the future. Yeah, I think you're right. Both the utility types that we have in Australia are going to be, there are challenges for both of them, I think, going forward.
Yes, challenges coming in all directions. Let me try to understand. You mentioned about low duration curve, right? 80 hours that it goes up, the peak demand. I did a lot of demand modeling. That was my first job at ACCP with a Helm system. And those days, we used to take demand figures, how the industry is selling, apply and demand shape and model that how different thing. We predicted, our model predicted that Victoria is moving from winter peak to summer peak as more and more people are buying air conditioners early 90s.
Yeah.
Now there is one element that is happening that no one can control. Like I have tons of gadgets in this room and I'm just looking around. Out of these 20 gadgets, right now, maybe only 5% has built-in batteries. In 10 years' time, maybe 70% will have built-in batteries, which means that you have completely flattened the demand curve. If I switch on this light, it's nothing to do with the grid. This computer has a battery, it's running, if the power goes off, it keeps on running. Its demand instantaneously doesn't go. It gets dampened by the fact it has its own storage. Then if my house has a storage, again, another dampening factor, it don't go to the grid. And if you have a solar, it's not going to the grid, which we are seeing to the duck curve anyway. That will have a tremendous impact in this low duration curve. A lot of demand will just run away and move to become a base load, because you can always program these batteries to charge from your home batteries, and home batteries will only charge if you don't have solar, maybe during off-peak time. So I personally think the load duration curve dramatically will change. Our load factor, the load shape that we have, evening peak, is almost eventually become very flat. And that's where I personally think that a lot of transmission areas, a lot of substation where there's a bit of grid congestion because the peak time everybody's here is like a traffic, that might actually slowly go and create some stranded asset risks.
That's absolutely a scenario that the price of lithium ion or an alternate technology continue to decline. And it's 15% decline the last 10 years per annum. So you certainly don't go betting against that. And with that comes miniaturization and productization. So it gets moved in smaller and smaller packages into devices like you're talking about, like your fridge and your stove and cooktops and things like that. I think that's an absolute potential. Equally, if we get this right and the prices continue to fall and we have a really efficient system, now I think it's questionable whether that scenario would play out just due to customer demand. Quite possibly. On the fringe of the grid, absolutely. In fact, if you look at the fringe of the grid, we've grown the grid over the last 100 years in Australia, and it's extended more and more into the outback, into rural areas, as it became economic to do. The economics have changed with battery prices and solar voltaics starting to supplant the value of the grid. So it costs, from a network perspective, $2,000 a year to serve as the average customer. It's costing 10 and even 20 grand a year to service a very rural and very remote customer, not to mention the bushfire risk community areas. So clearly there's an opportunity to say, if we're spending 20 or even 10 grand a year, you can now get a home standalone power system for far less than that. So maybe there's a model where the fringe of the grid starts retracting back in and consumers move off the grid, and WA is leading the charge there.
Horizon Power was actively doing that, taking people off the grid, saying, bye-bye. We'll provide you so that you don't have to come back.
50% of their overhead lines, this is their forecast, that they're going to remove 50% of their overhead lines due to the better pricing options from solar and batteries. So that's just a fascinating turn of events. I think when we see an overabundance of storage in the grid and possibly in other architectures, then there's a real opportunity that the demand curve will flatten and be flattened by, but we've got to get the incentives right. So again, the distribution grid probably remains relatively useful. Again, more of a focus needed on the low voltage and high voltage systems rather than the bigger transmission systems. From the consumer perspective, we just have to keep those options open to make sure the technology changes don't catch us by surprise and that we give customers choice in this space. So they might not want to buy a fridge with a battery. They're quite happy just plugging it in. So the option is there for the consumer.
Hang on. Yes, I completely agree. But the way the batteries are getting into appliances, it's not consumer choice. It's just that they are looking at the marketplace saying, okay, a decent fan costs $100. Putting an extra tiny battery costs $20. I'll just add it in. And people are buying, almost the same. They're selling it. You own power will not be interrupted. Fridge, 150 watt. It runs half the time. So if you put even a 3 kilowatt hour battery, the fridge value will be very different. Saying, hey, it will get even a half a kilowatt hour battery. Saying, yeah, it will let you ride through 6 hours. And it will be a tad heavier. People say, okay, somebody starts marketing. So I think what will happen, a consumer does not need tariff sort of thing. They will just look at the utility value of uninterrupted television or uninterrupted internet. I don't know why people have not put one into the router. If there's a power failure in anywhere, the first thing people care about, okay, internet is not working, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an option. Absolutely. Don't discount this. And you take it to the extreme and see the whole house being wired for DC, the batteries sitting in every device.
Yeah.
I think it's an option. I wouldn't want to force consumers down that path until we see that the consumer is adopting that pathway.
Today, you are in Melbourne. Average house price, Melbourne is almost $1 million Australian. To put a 20 kilowatt hour battery right now, if you go for Tesla Powerwall, it costs you $15,000. Two of them.
Two of them. No, it's unfortunately it's about $12,000 per Tesla battery at the moment.
I said the Powerwall 2, they are giving a huge discount. It's about 12,000 per, yeah. But I'm saying the battery price, cell level is 100 kilowatt hour. Tesla batteries, a high margin and a lot of other things. But if the battery price only was $5,000 and you can create a trend becomes every time you sell your house, hey, just add on a $1,000 battery. This is how you pay to stage your house to make it look good. If it's a solar, if you have battery, it will sell better. If that trend becomes, everyone will add the batteries. The cost, considering the value of your house, it's so little, right? So I'm saying suddenly these things can come even without the incentive. And then, of course, you have the time of use feed-in tariff, which are quite unique, right? People say, hey, I'm getting 5 cents a kilowatt hour by selling solar daytime. If I get 15 at night, wow, that's amazing, no? So I think this can happen not without the policy. It might just happen suddenly people start buying.
Absolutely agree it's an option, but I just don't see it as the only future that exists in space.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, I think there's plenty to look at there, and it's this whole trade-off between scalability and where the value lies. So obviously you install a big battery right at where a generator is today, and you can get some energy arbitrage and FCAS, frequency control benefits, but it doesn't deliver any reliability to the end consumer, because if the lines fall down in between, they're still down and it still can't get power. But then the other extreme, a battery in every appliance, of course, then every appliance can ride out an outage, even the loss of wiring in the home, and the appliances are still operational. And so, there's this trade-off of value versus cost, because there is an economy of scale issue here as well. 100 small batteries in the home will undoubtedly cost more than one large one in the home. So it's just where the consumer finds the best value there. But you're right, there's one option is it becomes so cheap that trade-off is just negligible, and we all fall towards batteries everywhere and everything. And under that scenario, then you're right, the grid disappears, because people, when they can, will generate their own and will have the significant risk of sunk assets, and then people in apartments struggling to find it to stay connected or pay the charges because they can't generate enough sufficiently on site to service their own internal demand. But anyway, we're still a fair way from that. I think in the interim, short to middle term, the grid's going to expand materially actually to meet just the new demand from electric vehicles. And then after that, I think we could see a material change to those demand curves, which mean there is some stranded asset occurring at that point.
Now, on the policy side, Victoria has new ban on adding gas to new households, right? And I was interviewing a guest last week, and that also allows people to, say, completely disconnect from old gas and fuel equivalent, say, hey, I don't want a gas connection, and you pay an exit fee of some kind. The question I always been thinking, that all the distribution companies have an obligation to connect a household, whether it costs $2,000 or $20,000. That's a universal obligation that they have to connect. But does the consumer have a right now, on the flip side of it, to disconnect? Maybe not, because there would be straightaway stranded asset issues. So how is the discussion in Victoria in terms of eventually allowing, or what's the policy right now? If I go tomorrow and say, hey, United Energy, I don't need you anymore, I decided to opt out, am I allowed to go out?
There's no restrictions on consumers disconnecting. I think they're not called exit fees. There might be disconnection fees that apply to come out, take the meter, clamp the ends of the copper pipe or the PVC pipe or whatever it is, and it physically disconnects supply from the site. And I think it would be a very brave politician that came about and said, yeah, I'll support a disconnection fee or force you to remain connected. I mean, neither of those things are realities.
But it was the case. I remember facing a case when we privatized, again, putting my old Victorian power regulatory hat. There was a case in PowerCo in the rural Victoria where customers wanted to disconnect it and put a genset, and PowerCo came back. And then we had to say, no, please sort it out because you have an obligation, but consumer doesn't really have a right to disconnect that way or something, because PowerCo was arguing we invested. It was a deep connection asset. We have dedicated transformer and everything else, and they just go away with the diesel.
I was just going to say, I rung the bell in my head, and I do remember that economic bypass conversation that was happening back there, and it still existed as a law today, a regulatory artifact. But yeah, for large consumers, I think it's a different conversation, and there's often material sort of assets being invested there. From a small scale of residential customers, I think the protections and the systems around that will remain. It will be interesting when the remaining few customers on the gas grid see a twofold increase in gas connection costs, and they start hurriedly trying to get off, and how we deal with vulnerable and low-income households in that space is going to be another challenge. But I think the other aspect, of course, is the government has provided a guarantee rate of return for these monopoly assets, gas and electric. It'll be really interesting to see how we deal with that when you get to the exponential price increase point, because of the remaining few customers just can't service the grid, on how much should they be paying for anyway, outside of their direct feed. It's be a really complex challenge. And we're hurriedly moving into that, because I think the movement towards electrification of everything is quite strong. There's many suburbs now, and city councils are progressing plans for electrifying everything in their vicinity, in their locality that they can. So that means the degradation of gas incomes, which will severely affect, obviously, the costs for those who remain connected.
Yeah, I think that equity issue eventually will come, because the rich household will have the largest batteries, and they will have the right or the ability to move out. And then, as you mentioned at the beginning, what happens to all those apartments?
Yeah, certainly in that transition phase, we're far better off if we can provide incentives for the people with the energy storage capacity and electricity generation capacity to share their excess with others, and reward them for it, but reward them in a way that lowers costs for all consumers. And you can do that. It can be either a direct payment via some sort of trading scheme, or it can just be, we can accomplish a lot of those similar outcomes with just better tariffs, dynamic, bidirectional, mirrored tariffs that provide the signals to consume more energy during the middle of the day when the sun's shining, and contribute back to the grid, or reduce your consumption from the grid in the evening peaks. And the incentives that sit around that ideally want to support better outcomes, not just for the consumers that have the battery and can do that, but also lowers costs for everyone through those payment methods.
In the ideal scenario, fully implemented, how does large household behave, and how will household in apartment behave? Can you take us through just the understanding?
Yeah, in a perfect future world, we've got system controls first that sit there. If a customer's given a dynamic operating envelope for their connection point, so they're not only for a forecast 24-hour period, this isn't the consumer having to do this. The home energy management system is seeing this forecast saying you're only allowed to export so much every half hour, and you're only allowed to import up to a certain level every half hour. And that will vary over the day, depending on whether the sun's shining or whether we're moving to a demand period. And so the customer's operating within that safety barrier. And so that's protecting system stability and security. Then we get into the trading system. So the consumer with a large battery or an EV that's working with the grid sees a time variable price. So in the middle of the day, obviously, they've probably got solar on their roof, but ideally they're charging up their battery possibly from the grid, because that's going to be cheaper for them. Not even, in theory, turning off their solar because they're being paid to charge their battery from the grid. And so that's certainly could be a likelihood in spring, not so much possibly in summer or in winter periods when there's high intrinsic levels of demand. And then in the evening time, the consumer, maybe they've got their own 5 kilowatt load, but they choose to run their battery at a 10 kilowatt export and put 5 into the grid because they're getting paid 20 cents a kilowatt hour or 30 cents a kilowatt hour to actually contribute at that time. So they're making money and throughout the day from that battery, that they're also contributing to lower network costs and lower energy fuel costs throughout the day by that intrinsic level of behavior. And so requires some smarts to tie all this together, but it also requires the right signals there. And the one thing I did want to reiterate is that we've got pricing signals. This electricity systems, it's always had pricing signals. We need to get them better, significantly better. But the security apparatus that exists on the transmission and distribution grids today needs to up. And that's probably a big gap that I'm seeing at the moment. There's some movement here in South Australia with flexible export limits and in other states now. But if we don't do something there, we're going to have a real security issue with potential for the lights go out, and that always gains a lot of attention when that does occur. But ideally, we want to avoid that. So identifying that we need to get the markets in place, I need to get a system security apparatus in place as well at the same time. They're two parallel pathways. You can't always rely on markets to deliver safe outcomes there. And there's a really good example that's been doing the rounds, that a future evening that's really hot down in Melbourne or Sydney or whatever, when peak demand, we're reaching peak demand. And then, as typically happens, a cold front comes through, and it's usually quite strong. And so the Bureau of Meteorology issues a storm warning. And so everyone who's discharging their batteries or their electric vehicles at that time goes, hang on a minute, if the power goes out, I want to be ready and have everything fully charged. So they switch to charging up. And that's where the system falls over, because the grid physically couldn't handle that switch, either from a system stability perspective or just simply the physical network constraints of delivering that much energy, essentially doubling the demand just based on that scenario. And so we'll need to develop systems and security procedures that will stop that from occurring, or essentially stop that from occurring, or limit it severely.
Yeah, so that means that transmission companies have to go to the regulator and argue about extra cash and assign a probability of that event, and someone has to make a judgment call, because it offers the regulatory asset base and one day, not so distant future, into the stranded asset base.
Yes, potentially. So fortunately, what we're seeing at the moment is, to address minimum demand in South Australia, they're doing a flexible export limit, which is where the inverters operate today, or the inverters that are connected in that model, will limit themselves when South Australia's got too much energy and doesn't know, and then can't get rid of it. And so they'll be called on to limit their output during those scenarios. And you can see that same model potentially operating for electric vehicles and batteries in the home as well on the import side. So you don't get that hot evening double peak that we were just talking about. And so what we're seeing with the flexible exports, though, is that state governments are taking the lead in this space and mandating it. And Queensland has it included in their energy and jobs plan. And I think Victoria is moving in that space, and South Australia's already implemented the flexible exports. So we're seeing that movement occurring there. It's not requiring the networks to actually promulgate this and seek regulatory approval. It's essentially becoming a state by state mandate as they see the future risk of minimum demand starting to get real.
Excellent. These are all happening in the power supply side of it. On the demand side of it, what sort of thinking you have on the impact of electric vehicle on the grid? If the electric vehicle, like a cyber truck now, can charge other cars, because the V2L component is becoming quite significant. So if the cars moving around charging each other, so that also creates another level of uncertainty that economists and the modelers cannot manage.
I love that future scenario where you had autonomous electric vehicles who just drive around into suburbs where demand is high and plug themselves in and supply locally. And during the day when supply is high, they're also going to those suburbs, picking up the energy and transferring it. That's just a fantastic concept. We're a fair way away from that one, I think, on a number of technological levels, but it's theoretically possible in our future. Network EVs will naturally, as discussed, increase overall demand in the short term. We really do need to progress V2G and vehicle to load because it's not Tesla is the best of my knowledge can't do it. They've got a circuitry that is simply not capable of export the Powerwall of the etc. The vehicles themselves aren't there yet. Mr. Musk has talked about it, but the F-100 Lightning from the US, that's clearly can do it. And there's people posting videos with big, broad smiles on their faces while the houses are being supplied during a power outage. And that's a really cool concept. And tradesmen running all of their equipment from their car during the day and that sort of thing. So you see, there's some real interesting benefits there. And we're probably only at the start of that sort of revolution. If you look at just looking at what we've got, I think AMO in Australia, the system planner, is forecasting 10 million electric vehicles by 2040 or 2050 from memory. And so even if we assume that's a hell of a lot of capacity, let's assume that they're connected at 7 kilowatts into the homes. Obviously, there's level 2 charges in the home that are much higher than that, but there will also be some that are just trickle fed from the local power outlet. So the potential there for vehicle to grid is going to be quite high. So that's 50 gigawatts in the end of the day. I'll have to go and check my math, but current system peak's about 36 gigawatts, I think. So it's going to be a pretty material change when we have that sort of capacity that is potentially responsive and flexible and completely at customers' discretion too. It's really going to be a fascinating shift. It's early days in the recognition of how that will change the dynamics of the system. Got a long way to go yet in understanding that. To be honest, I don't have it all in my head.
I just looked up. Yes, Mr. Musk have been arguing or being silent on V2G because everybody's saying, hey, I can't do anything with my Tesla. But I was surprised at the Cybertruck that got released last week. It has apparently 5 outlets, power outlets that you can use, and collectively 9.6 kilowatt you can take out. And V2L, and it can charge other EVs. So that's a spanner in the game.
Love that concept. It's really important that we have this connectivity because it's an expected need from consumers that these things they will connect and share energy just the same way you expect your devices to connect to the internet and be able to post and read and do whatever you want. You don't expect to be locked into a particular ecosystem. So there'll be another future challenge for regulators as we start seeing, could be Tesla or others, seeking to create their own Apple-type ecosystems that don't play nicely with the other ecosystems out there. And we'll see possibly some moves from the antitrust areas like we saw in the US when the internet first came out. I think we haven't seen the big moves yet. I know Tesla's put out a retail license, so that's fantastic that they want to move into that space. Be interesting to see how they tie in the abilities of the Powerwall and future smart vehicles into an operating system and how well they share and whether these things will talk and operate together over nicely or whether we'll have these walled gardens where no one can share information and do things outside of their ecosystems. We'll just have to see.
It's a fascinating world that we live in right now.
It's great, isn't it? So it's very lucky to be involved, I think, tell young engineers. I was born at the SEC and worked in the SEC for the first 10 years of my career, and it was good, and I learned a lot, but I'm so lucky I didn't have 30 to 40 years in that same career, and that this system is changing so dramatically that there's so much ideas and opportunities and learnings that it's been quite continual. And so that's fantastic area to be in.
So what do you tell young entrepreneurs or young engineers who's looking for work? What should they do? The world is now, you have to actually decide what to do, no? There's so much opportunities and excitement. Electricity industry used to be a boring place to be.
That's right. A transformer and a pole and a wire, those things were built 100 years ago. And if you ask someone from 100 years to look at the system today, they'd still be able to say, well, that looks like the poles from my day. And there's a few different things about them maybe, but not a hell of a lot. The transformers still copper windings or now aluminum windings and all that sort of stuff. So the technology hasn't moved a lot in that space except for distributed energy and solar voltaics, lithium-ion batteries, and the comms architecture that comes around that, because just share information, make smarter decisions in real time. That's the big change, the big enabler that often sits below the surface. What would I tell really, I've been lucky enough to just be able to follow my interests, and that has provided a career for me. And so I think, yeah, be inquisitive, ask questions, and follow what interests you. And I think it's not always going to work, but if it does, you'll have a fantastic career.
And what should they look into specifically in this evolving energy industry? Which part you think will be more interesting going forward?
It all depends on them, because there are so many needs and opportunities in their space. As I said, I'm constantly amazed when I speak to behavioral architects and educators in this space, because there's so much they know that I don't know, and so much that they can do in this space to improve outcomes for all consumers just by understanding consumer behaviors and better learning and feeding and changing and those behaviors in ways that benefits all. And yes, of course, there's the technical, and you can get super deep into that side of things. And there's the regulatory and policy aspects, which absolutely huge amounts of work are needed there. So I think there isn't any where I'd point at to say, this is the area that to go and investigate. There is so much happening that you can match your interests and desires and your intrinsic skill set with many of the needs out there, and hopefully make a viable and really exciting career out of it.
And also, that's fantastic. Yes, that's where the world is. They will never be bored working in the power sector anymore. The power sector has expanded. How do you keep yourself up to date on this technology side? What should people do, or what do you do just to be up to date? What's happening? It's a lot to catch up, right? Every day.
There is, yeah. There's great podcasts like yours, of course, that are out there. But as well, I use LinkedIn. I don't want to say LinkedIn's the only one, other social media as well. But I find I use LinkedIn to actually just capture when I see something that captures my attention and I want to read it or archive it. I actually use LinkedIn because it's interesting to me. It's often interesting to others. So there's a good sharing mechanism there. And the community's pretty good. One of the least negative communities out there. You never do away with some of the toxic aspects of any social media, I don't think, but that's been pretty good. Twitter's pretty good. I've moved off that recently just because it was rather just negative. But then lots of reading. So there's quite a few journals and lots of research as well. And then obviously being involved in some of the institutional projects that are going on from regulatory perspective and supporting government work in this space helps a lot with continuing to build up the knowledge across this space. So it's being inquisitive and having a broad set of options to feed the mind with.
Yeah, you are super privileged because you're also working with the governments inside. You're inside the boiler room. You're not just outsider looking in.
Yeah, that's right. But that's a chicken and egg problem, isn't it? You've got to start somewhere, but also lucky to work with great people. I think you and I have shared some great work colleagues over the years, and you learn so much from these smart people. And again, it's great to speak to people who are different from you and with different focus in their lives to understand what drives them, but also see things from their perspective and understand that my narrow niche field is important and is interesting, but it's only part of a very broad array of fields that are super critical that we progress along.
We have not asked AI. That will be another hour of conversation. But we leave that for the time being. How can one reach you? What's the best option to reach you?
I would suggest get in contact with me on LinkedIn. My surname is quite unusual, so there's not too many of us out there. Easy to find, and that's probably the best way for communication. It's probably email. It's useful, but I think the sharing of ideas, social media concept there is usually a really good start.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for your questions. It's made me think of some of these areas in a different way. So it's always fun to have a chat, and I appreciate you reaching out, Sahel. It's been very interesting.
Thank you so much. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energypreneurs. To continue listening to this conversation, please visit us at Energypreneurs. Thank you. See you next time.